G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're looking at my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Imola Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Before we jump into how my team is shaping up, all the chip usage strategies and team selection dilemmas, I'm going to take a look at what's making headlines in the F1 and F1 Fantasy world this week. First cab off the rank is the Aston Martin constructor asset, which after the Miami Grand Prix dropped into the C tier asset class. For a breakdown on the asset classes and their pricing structure based on the tier they fall into, be sure to check out my video on how to build team value. It breaks out each of the drivers and constructors and the situations where they will move up and down in price by a certain amount based on how they perform in any given race week. In Aston Martin's case, they dropped into the C tier, which is for anything priced under 15 million. And as a result, they're expected to increase in price more so than any other asset priced in the A or the B tier, just based on a good performance alone. Now, you might be thinking, for those of you that are looking to build a little bit more budget, whether or not they become a viable fantasy asset for this week to catch maybe the 0.5 million or $1 million price increase. And in its most basic form, my answer to whether or not you should get them into your team is probably not. Now, I find it very hard to make the case for Aston Martin as a budget building constructor, even as a C-tier asset. And I've talked about that on Twitter a little bit already in the last week or so. But based on the price changes we've seen from some of the other assets, constructor assets, particularly in the game, most fascinatingly to me is that Aston Martin have only gone up 1 million from their starting price at the start of the season. You look at a constructor like Red Bull, they've gone up 0.8 million. And sure, Aston Martin probably have more room to grow in terms of price if they have a couple of good results, but you're also sacrificing the points on the table that Red Bull or even Ferrari might have to offer. Now, Ferrari have gone up 2.5 million by comparison. So they are perhaps budget building in and of itself, given how well Ferrari have performed so far this season. But when you look at Red Bull and their fast pit stop points that they can score, they've scored 67 out of a possible 108 this season. Ferrari have scored 33 out of the 108 total on offer through 6 races. Aston Martin have had 0, and they've also had the most DNFs of those 3 constructors, which are what most people are running at the moment, Red Bull and Ferrari. So you're really taking a hit on the likely points that you're leaving on the table going without a Red Bull or a Ferrari asset, and hoping for the price increase from Aston Martin to offset that point sacrifice. Now, if you're really desperate for budget, then I think sure, you can make the case maybe to gamble on Aston Martin for a week or two while they sit in the C tier. But realistically, you have to be content with the fact that if Aston Martin don't have as great a week as, say, Red Bull or Ferrari, and you're going without one of those 2 constructors, you just have to be content with the fact that your rank's probably going to slip a little bit in that particular week. You're also relying primarily on Lance Stroll to have a good result. We just haven't seen much of that at all this season from him fantasy-wise. And you also need Fernando Alonso to lift the constructor into a podium finish, which just doesn't seem likely to me at the moment, given that Ferrari, McLaren, and Red Bull are the top 3 teams. It's pretty locked in based on the upgrades that they're rolling out at the moment and the performances we've seen from them recently. So I think it is realistically a bit of a gamble based on how high performing Red Bull and Ferrari are. And unless you're, as I said, very desperate to build some budget, they're probably not worth the sacrifice for points, given they just haven't really delivered through 6 races this season. As for Ferrari upgrades, another headline that seems to have grabbed a lot of attention since Miami. Now, Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc have already driven quite well through 6 races this season. And from what a number of sources are saying online, they are expected to bring upgrades that would be one of the most sizable they push out this season. There's a lot of speculation about how much time it's going to unlock, and they were pretty competitive in race pace in Miami already. So it's a great sign that these upgrades are hopefully going to add even more to the performance based on what we've seen so far. I think for me, the constructor is already, in my opinion, close to a non-negotiable in most teams, not just based on the performance of Leclerc and Sainz, but as I pointed out just before, the fast pit stop points, they're one of the best value for money assets in the game overall. And I just don't see that likely to slip up anytime soon either, even with the emergence of McLaren. I think Ferrari, if these upgrades go as planned and they are on par with Red Bull, then I think a win is certainly not far away for either driver on screen here. So whether or not it's several tenths or a couple of tenths, we'll have to wait and see from practice. But I think that absolutely makes Ferrari constructor close to must-have. And I think it also opens the door for Sainz and Leclerc as potential DRS boost options on non-sprint weekends in particular. And the reason I say that is because when you've got the sprint weekends, Max Verstappen's more often than not always going to be the highest scoring driver in that 2x slot. Because the point spread is much smaller over non-sprint weekends, Leclerc and Sainz probably has a much closer reach to matching or getting close to matching Max through those sessions. And you throw in the fact that Ferrari and McLaren drivers have scored 14 out of the last 15 driver of the day awards. So if you're gambling on, or maybe not gambling, but if you're going for one of these two guys, Sainz or Leclerc, there's a fair chance with a good result that they're going to score that extra 10 points as well. So I think there's a lot of different options to consider for this week. I'm very eagerly awaiting the F1 Fantasy Tools projections because of all these different circumstances and simulations that could present us with a bunch of different scenarios for our lineups. But I think for these two guys, it certainly edges them, in my opinion, slightly ahead of Perez. I'd say out of the two, even though Sainz has won one race this year already in Australia, Leclerc has looked much better over the last few races. So I'm leaning towards him as probably the next best DRS boost option behind Verstappen. Then I'd probably throw in Norris, Sainz, and then Perez behind that. So it is a bit of a mixed bag, and the simulations for everyone kind of between 25 and 20 million are quite similar. So that's why I'm very much looking forward to seeing where they come out before we get to the qualifying deadline. But just keep an eye on Ferrari through practice, because I think if those upgrades deliver, they're going to look very good and very strong to rival Red Bull and McLaren. Now, this is a slightly newer section to my usual race week preview and final thoughts videos. I have historically had watch list videos which have been hit and miss, if I'm being completely honest. So I wanted to maybe lump these into the race week preview. I'm thinking about maybe otherwise including them in my team selection video. So let me know in the comments if you like this section in this video, if you like it in my team selection video as kind of like an immediate reaction to the race results. But I wanted to get a snapshot on a couple of drivers that are catching my attention ahead of the next Grand Prix. The first one for me is Pierre Gasly, and Gasly has really jumped out at me in the last couple of races as one to watch. We've obviously been informed of Alpine's improvement to the floor on that A524, and they've made a number of steps forward to reduce the weight of the car as well. Gasly in particular has, up until Miami, been the lower of the two Alpine drivers that qualifies week to week. And I think that bodes very well from a fantasy perspective. We typically want those drivers priced, under 10 million or so, qualifying slightly worse, making those additional overtakes and positions gained. And that's put him in good stead to outscore not just Ocon, but almost every driver priced under, I think it was 19 million in the last two races. The only driver that scored more than his 28 points across China and Miami is Zhou with 33 points. And Gasly himself has also, as I said, outscored Ocon over that same time period. He also only in Miami out-qualified Ocon then. Up until that point, his best qualifying result was P15. So it's a great sign, fantasy-wise anyway, that Gasly's not quite up to scratch on qualifying, but as long as he can keep the car on track, make those additional overtakes and bank those points, I think he becomes very viable. And he's also racked up a bunch of overtakes, 15 in total over the last 2 weekends. And I think particularly at 8.3 million, it makes a very easy swap into a driver like Kevin Magnussen, who's been kind of used as a wrecking ball of sorts for Haas to protect Hülkenberg's points, who we'll get onto later on, and maybe an Albon, who Williams, I think, had a lot of high hopes for heading into this season, but that car, they've obviously had to compromise a little bit on to make it more balanced and suited to more tracks. As a result, I think they've taken a couple of steps back, and Albon at 8 million probably just doesn't seem to be screaming value to me at the moment. So I think if Gasly can continue on this trajectory, we're going to see consistent performances. He's an experienced driver, and we've seen what he can do. He scored podiums, he's won races. I definitely can see him featuring in the points once Alpine can continue to push forward, match it up with Haas, even maybe RB every so often. So I think he makes for a very good replacement if you're looking to move out Kevin Magnussen or Alex Albon in Imola. Now, the other driver I wanted to talk about was Nico Hülkenberg. I'd mentioned before that, he's been a driver that Magnussen has more so in recent races tried to protect at the expense of his, maybe not at the expense of, but for the benefit of his teammate. Haas have obviously got themselves into a bit of a midfield scrap, hopefully with RB. Not sure if they're able to stick with them over the entire season, but they've certainly got Alpine, Sauber and Williams breathing down their neck. Now, I think Hülkenberg has demonstrated his proficiency as an experienced driver, and you've seen his recent signing with Sauber/Audi is one they value very highly. But there's also talk that Haas are bringing some upgrades to Imola, and I think they want to make those steps forward, that continued improvement, and build on what they've already got as a good baseline to maintain that kind of performance around P6, P7 in the constructors. Now, I don't know yet what those upgrades look like, but notwithstanding that, at 8.1 million, Hulk's a really good option. I'm thinking about potentially bringing him in for Alex Albon this week in Imola, and they are looking to kind of reel in the RB. So if they can deliver on their promises for upgrades, I think that'll be certainly very good to keep in mind. The one thing I will say about Nico is that he does qualify quite well. And as I mentioned before about Gasly, you want drivers that don't qualify as well so they have more upside to make positions gained. The one thing I will say, though, has to have much improved race pace as we've observed through the last 6 races. So I certainly think that's not really as much of a factor as I thought. And if you're looking at someone like K-Mag, who's just going to continue, if they go with that strategy of protecting his teammate, defending a lot of the other midfield teams, I think Hülkenberg can certainly capitalize on those extra points in the top half of the grid. So I really like Hulk. He's reliable, he's dependable, and he's experienced. So if you haven't already got him in your team, then I'd certainly think about it heading into the race weekend. I'll quickly look at the weather forecast, another segment that's a little newer to this video in particular, and I'll probably just have a brief segment on this moving forward, given that, weather can be very much a factor in our decision making week to week. It is forecast for some rain over the course of the weekend, and that, I think, may open the door if it gets particularly concerning for the autopilot chip. I think autopilot in particular becomes very valuable because it protects as an insurance policy against your 2x DRS boost driver. Now, as far as how much rain we expect over the weekend, I'm not sure it's going to be an insane amount compared to what we saw last year, where the race itself was ultimately cancelled because the track was flooded. I think there's meant to be some precipitation on Friday and Sunday. Saturday may be a slightly drier day, but just keep that in mind. From what I'm seeing, it may not be race defining, but if you have some concerns about wet weather drivers' reliability, drivers like Sargent, for instance, doesn't fill me with confidence at the best of times. You throw in wet weather and that could be an absolute disaster. Maybe just think about how that could affect your decision. But I certainly think rain could throw a spanner in the works. And as I said, autopilot's probably the only chip I would think about at the moment. Maybe no negative, but I just feel there's more value there to unlock on a sprint weekend with that extra session and an extra risk of DNFs. But if you feel so inclined based on the weather and the historical trends there, then maybe think about using no negative if you really feel strongly about it. But that's my thought. I don't think it'll be really a huge factor this weekend. Hopefully a dry race and a boring weekend F1 fantasy-wise, just because there are no sprints. And then last but not least is chip and team selection for the weekend. Now, I've already talked about the DRS boost options. I think Verstappen stands out to me week in, week out as the best option there, but obviously it comes with some sacrifice and to the balance and composition of the rest of your team. Now, I think it would be silly of me to say what the best lineup is without seeing the points projections. And why I say that is because before we hit the sprint weekends in China and Miami, a lot of the simulations were catered to more of the Leclerc, Sainz, Perez builds with more of a Stroll, Tsunoda, etc. Now, I know since Japan, for example, our budgets have increased a little bit. We have a bit more financial flexibility and reach to get in some other assets and build our team in another way. But I do think that the gap between Verstappen, Red Bull, Ferrari teams and say a Leclerc or a Sainz and Red Bull, Ferrari teams are going to be a lot smaller. And if you're discouraged by owning someone like Logan Sargent, for example, then perhaps going with a non-max lineup and building out the rest of your team with the Sonodas, the Hulkenbergs, for example, might just give us a little bit more cushion and a safety blanket, particularly if we have a little bit of wet weather on one of the days. That throws a bit of a spanner in the works, creates a little bit of risk. You want those experienced drivers and not the Logan Sargents and the Lance Strolls kind of running amok with DNFs. So I think that's certainly just something to think about. I'd love to give you an answer right now, and I'm not sure I have one for you, but I have Verstappen in my team at the moment. And if I go for a Leclerc, Norris, Sainz, or Perez as my DRS boost, it's probably wildcard time because I've got a lot of rubbish, a lot of unreliable Williams and Sauber drivers in my lineup. So that's one such option I would consider, which kind of segues nicely into chip strategy. Now, if I don't go with a wildcard for the reasons I've just mentioned, I've also mentioned autopilot as a kind of a hedge or a risk protection against your DRS boost, which is obviously a huge part of how you score points on your weekend. And then there's the no negative, which I haven't got on the screen here, but again, I think there's more value to be realized with that chip on sprint race weekends. I wouldn't say it's time for any of the other chips in the game, and I know F1 Fantasy Tools, if you follow them along on Twitter, did mention that the Limitless chip does have some value to be unlocked on non-sprint weekends where we see a pretty defined order in qualifying, and that could certainly build a bit of a gap between you and your mini league rivals, for example. But I'm not sure if Imola is the right weekend unless you see a lot of factors and signs pointing towards that decision. But a lot of people have already used their Limitless in China and Miami, so there's probably very few left that want to use it. I know some people have maybe talked about Austria, but I'm not so sure if Imola's the track. A couple of drivers in Piastri and Sargent haven't even raced in an F1 car here before. So a few different things moving, but I think notwithstanding, just something to think about. Probably a no-chip weekend for many of us. And the last thing I wanted to cover off is how my team's looking for the race weekend. As I said before, I've got Verstappen and, as I like to call, the cheese and lettuce of the Sauber and Williams scraps in my team. I think realistically, if I do stick with a lineup like this, all very much contingent on the F1 Fantasy Tools sims, my only likely move for me is going to be Alex Albon in for someone like K-Mag, Pierre Gasly, or Hulkenberg. Pretty much anyone up to K-Mag in terms of price. I'm not so sure I'm loving Kevin Magnussen. He has been exceptional value through the first few races this season, but he was used as a battering ram in Miami. Whether or not they employ a similar strategy moving forward, I don't know if I necessarily see that happening, but he is on a lot of penalty points. I don't think he's going to be suspended overnight, but at the same time, there is probably some risk at the moment with going with him. I think Pierre Gasly and Hulkenberg are probably the two most likely moves for me this weekend. Alternatively, if I did stick with Alex Albon, I could also get to Hulk and replace him with Zhou. But from what I understand, Sauber's wheel nut issue has improved a little bit. They're in Europe now, so from what I gathered a couple of weeks ago, they've got access to more parts, given they're closer to their factory and such. So maybe I think I'm leaning towards sticking with Zhou. I think Albon seems like the most logical candidate. But if I don't go for a Max Verstappen, Red Bull and Ferrari lineup, and I whip out the wild card, I'll probably go for a Leclerc, clean out all of this deadwood. Maybe I keep Valtteri. Let's just keep him in for now. But it would look something, and again, certainly not settled on this lineup as of right now, but it could look something like Leclerc, Sonoda, Hulkenberg, I don't know, Gasly, something like this. Maybe move out Bottas. But I think if I am activating wildcard, I don't know, something like this. I'm not saying I want to go double Haas, but I suppose if I do activate the wildcard, then realistically, I'd want to be confident that I want this lineup or the foundations of this lineup for the next few weeks, because you don't want to get to the following race and be like, oh, sugar, I've got to move around half of my team because I suddenly don't like it. So I realistically think that I'll probably stand pat with this lineup for now and just wait and see what the practice sessions unveil. I want to see whether or not the Ferrari upgrades are as good as they are expected to be. And if they do, then maybe it's time to pull trigger on the wild card. But right now, very content with how things are at. Maybe one trade, roll a second into the next race and then reassess from there. But I'm going to leave it all there for now, guys. As always, I'll be back with FanAmp for a deadline stream Saturday morning in the US Eastern time at 9 o'clock. So I think it would be early afternoon in Europe and the UK. So drop by 1 hour before the qualifying session for us to answer all of your burning questions live on stream. And we'll do our best to get to as many as we can, as we always do, and review your lineups if you're submitting them in our FanAmp base. But I appreciate you guys dropping by. Good luck with your teams this weekend. I'll see you all very soon.